My name is Dr.G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Welcome to That's Unusual. My guest today is my dear friend, Roberta Baskin. She is a career investigative journalist who has spent much of her career secretly uncovering corporate misconduct around the world. What you likely don't know about her is that she has probably impacted more lives than one can possibly imagine. From uncovering the Nike sweatshop scandal, to revealing the undocumented toxic chemicals hidden within Heineken, to bringing justice to the massive fraudulent Medicaid scam of medically unnecessary root canal surgeries on helpless infants. Her stories and award-winning journalism have been featured on ABC's 2020, CBS's 48 Hours, Now with Bill Moyers, and numerous other mainstream media outlets. Over her career, she has received over 75 journalism prizes for her work, and if you ask me, deserves every one of those, if not more. Today, we are going to get an inside look into her process. Through her work, she has helped right many wrongs while helping transform companies along the way. With her latest initiative, Aim to Flourish, she has now turned her focus 180 degrees by helping uncover how corporations can be used for good. Aim to Flourish connects students with business leaders to discover and learn about innovations that do good and do well at the same time. Now that's something we can all aspire to. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to That's Unusual podcast. With me today is Roberta Baskin. Welcome to the show, Roberta.
Thank you, Dr. G. It's so great to be with you.
It's so nice having you on and hearing your voice again. I think we've got lots of great conversation that's going to unfold here, and I'm excited for my listeners to learn to get to know you as much as I know you and hear of the great stories that you have to share. So with that, we'll jump right in. And I really want to talk about, some of the things that we're seeing on television today are all about doom and gloom, and it's so depressing to really see what's going on in this world. And I'm afraid because my kids are looking at the television, they're being exposed to the same stuff. You've spent your entire career up until now, which we'll talk about some of the current things that you're doing as well, but you've spent most of your career investigating and revealing corporate corruption, misconduct, and greed, and really trying to hold those organizations accountable for social and moral responsibility. And you're highly decorated in terms of some of the reporting that you've done with number of awards and accolades that are well-deserved. And I'd like our listeners to really understand how you got started in this field of investigative journalism and really what was that journey like and got you to where you are today?
Well, I have to say, Dr. G, you could also fill up a filing cabinet with companies complaining about me also because of all the corporate misconduct stories that I did over more than 30 years. I mean, that was my passion. I just, bounded out of bed in the morning to tell you about a company doing a bad thing. And I felt like on a good day that it could change a company's behavior. That by exposing something that they were doing that was wrong or unjust, that they would change their behavior. So I started out in sunny Syracuse, New York, where the sun doesn't really shine very much, I'm sorry to say. And I was the director of the consumer department there. And it was kind of a crazy appointment because I had not graduated from college. I had not gone to journalism school. I was doing some things in the mayor's office that were just, things trying to address community issues. And he thought that I would be good in the consumer office. And I took this job really seriously, and apparently I wasn't supposed to. When I went to the corporation counsel and said, these companies are violating the Consumer Protection Code, we need to hold a public hearing and we need to, go after them under the Consumer Protection Code. He laughed me out of his office and said, no judge is going to take the Consumer Protection Code seriously. They'll throw it out of court. So I hired this lawyer who had just graduated from Syracuse University, and together we started enforcing the Consumer Protection Code. And one of the companies that we filed a lawsuit against was Beech-Nut Baby Food, because they had sent out a flyer to 760,000 new mothers across the country, warning these mothers of the dangers of making homemade baby food. They basically said that you could kill your kid, that there was a risk of a disease called methemoglobinemia, and with too much methemoglobin, your baby's skin turns blue and asphyxiation could result. This was scary.
Wow.
We had scare tactics under the Consumer Protection Code. So I called up the president of Beech-Nut Baby Food, and because I'm thinking, how did we survive for thousands of years before Beech-Nut came to the rescue? And they also sent these cents-off coupons to buy their Beech-Nut products. And I said to the president, I'm really concerned about this warning that you sent out to mothers. How many cases of methemoglobinemia do you have from homemade baby food? And he said, I don't know. I'll see if I could find some for you. This is before the internet. So I did this computer search on something called Medlars and found one case from homemade baby food in the United States and one case from commercial baby food. So I thought, well, this kind of balances out. And I called back the president and said, we really feel like you're scaring parents out of making homemade baby food. We want you to send out a corrective flyer to 760,000 mothers telling them it's okay to make homemade baby food. It's just as good an alternative as commercial baby food. And they wouldn't do it. So I held a press conference about it. And that ended up, it was a time when news directors were hiring people like you, Dr. G, to be a doctor, to be a medical reporter, a consumer advocate like me at the time to be a consumer reporter. And they invited me to come to Chicago and audition as a consumer reporter. I was super excited, flew out to Chicago, went out with a crew, sat in an editing room, put together this story. The news director said, thank you very much, but no thank you. And I was like, oh, what did I do wrong? And I went back to Syracuse and I thought, I really want this job. So I know I can do a better job. So I called the news director back and I said, I know you didn't like my presentation, but you really liked my story ideas. I know I can do a better job. I learned so much. That was my first try. Fly me back to Chicago and let me do another story, a different one. And I can show you how much better I can be. And they actually did it. He flew me back and I went out and did a different story, went out with the crew, sat with the editor, put it together. The news director said, thank you very much, but no thank you. I went back to Syracuse and I was like, I really want this job. I know. I mean, at the time I was thinking, holding a press conference about Beech-Nut baby food isn't going to get me, it's going to get me a lot farther than a lawsuit is, because it's kind of like instant gratification. You're able to tell viewers right away what their choices are, what their rights are, if a company is doing something wrong. So I was just really enamored of the opportunity and the possibility of being able to tell people what they needed to know right away. So I called up the news director and I said, you didn't like my first two stories. Well, you did like my story ideas. You just didn't like the way I told them. Please hire me anyway. Don't put me on the air. Pay me the least you can pay me under the union contract. And, just put me on the air when you think I'm ready, but I know I can do a really good job. This isn't brain surgery. It's, I'm trainable. And amazingly, he hired me. So it was actually in service to the tenacity that I would need in order to do investigative reporting without, prior experience. It was a lot more challenging than I thought it would be. I was extremely naive, thinking that I could really ace it. It took me a long time to learn the skills of, how to tell a television story and to grab your viewers' attention and to bring about change.
I love that sort of story of launching your career and that sense of naivety that almost gives you a certain level of confidence to say that you can hustle your way through and anything is possible. And sort of like that wide-eyed girl, that basically has
do that with investigative reporting. people don't want to do the interview. They see you coming and they go in the direction. They don't want to give you the documents to prove your story. So tenacity is kind of the journalism skill that I needed more than anything. And because I hadn't gone to journalism school, I think that there was a piece of me that was very insecure about that, and that I worked harder. I worked so hard, I really was passionate about the stories that I wanted to tell, and I would take chances and risks. When people said they wouldn't talk, I would show up anyway. I was willing to do things that somebody maybe with more of a skill set might not have considered doing.
So since then, you've actually gone on to report on some high profile studies and investigations, including the likes of the Nike sweatshops and the toxins within Heineken as well. What would you say, over the course of your career, what would you say is probably the most impactful story that you've revealed or uncovered or investigated that really had an impact on you personally and the influence that you've seen in people around you as a result?
Oh, wow. There are so many. It's like, who's your favorite child? It's like your children that you've worked hard. There's so many, different ones. I mean, the Nike story was a defining moment because I got into trouble with CBS News. I mean, I had broken the story about Nike's sweatshops in Vietnam, about women being paid less than the minimum wage of $40 a month for a 6-day work week for shoes that we were paying $135 for. And it ignited a firestorm, in terms of the public, where they were picketing Nike tents. There were boycotts organized. It really, got a lot of attention in universities and on campuses. But, what happened was Nike made a deal with CBS to have the correspondents wear Nike jackets at the Winter Olympics at Nagano. They were required to wear them on the air. And I objected to that in terms of being a violation of CBS News policy, and how would people trust us in terms of telling stories about sweatshops if, backroom deals were going to be made for advertising. And I ended up resigning over that. So that was a big in terms of a personal story, because it was kind of this network that I admired so much, the Edward R. Murrow network, the Tiffany network. And it kind of broke my heart to see a deal like that being made. But it did influence, Nike did, because of the public outrage, make a lot of changes within the organization. The other one that really, this takes me back to the very beginning again with my first job at WMAQ in Chicago. I was fired over a story that they wouldn't do. And I was objecting with the news director about it, saying that it's a really important story. This was about cancer-causing agents in beer, nitrosamines in beer, which are a very well-studied carcinogen and are regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I pushed and pushed with the news director to do this story, and he just basically didn't renew my contract. He was just thoroughly annoyed with me. And I wept. I felt like my life was over, that I had completely screwed up, that, back in Syracuse, I knew what I was doing and was doing a good job. And here, I was in Chicago and out of a job. Well, I scraped myself off the bathroom floor on Sunday night and wrote up a 1-page contract, which laid out what the story is. It was about the fact that I knew that we would find high levels of nitrosamines in beer, and that I wanted to test them. And I wanted to test them at the same place that the U.S. Brewers Association was testing. I knew the FDA was doing testing, and I knew that the German brewers had told the Americans how to fix the problem, but that they weren't fixing it. So I wrote up this little contract, and I went over to the number one station in town, WLS, and I put a little copyright symbol on the bottom of it saying that if you don't do it this way, then I'm going to take it somewhere else, and that you can't do the story without me. It was really a little crazy, but it worked. They hired me. I doubled my salary for the next 5 weeks, which is how long I said I would need to do the story. Back at WMAQ, I had said that I only wanted to test 3 beers. at WLS, I said I wanted to test 18 beers and that I wanted to go to Germany to interview the Germans who had uncovered the problem, go to DC to interview the head of the U.S. Brewers Association and interview the FDA, and go to Boston to interview the person who had developed the technology to test that the U.S. Brewers Association was using. The story was amazing. And it really was this was a huge personal lesson for me, because one bottle of Heineken was equivalent to 175 slices of bacon at the maximum legal level.
Wow.
Sure that bacon plants had been shut down for having nitrosamine levels considered, a health hazard. All the beer was very high except for Coors. And the head of the U.S. Brewers Association lied on camera and said it's a mystery drama. We don't know how the nitrosamines get in and the levels are really low. And then I was able to cut to Germany and have the German brewers say, oh no, we told the Americans they need to change their malting. If you direct fire the malt, you get nitrosamines. If you indirect fire it, you don't. So they had to spend money changing their process. And because the public didn't know about it, they weren't doing it. That story it was it had a huge impact. The FDA set a regulation in record time. Coors, the only beer that had no nitrosamines in it, took out a full-page newspaper ad in the Wall Street Journal saying Coors, the beer with no nitrosamines in it. That definitely inspired the rest of the industry. And it got cleaned up very quickly. And I got to go back to WMAQ. That was amazing because although I couldn't get it on the local news, Phil Donahue invited me to be on his Today Show spot to be recorded at the WMAQ studios to talk about the story.
These stories are certainly having a significant ripple effect across the industries, and it shows the power of what great investigative journalism can actually do. It sounds like in all of these cases, what's really interesting to me is the fact that you've always put, the story is much bigger than the self, and you've always, in some degree, sacrificed, yourself to make sure that the story gets told and the right message gets displayed out there. And I think that served to your advantage. What's even more fascinating to me is that you never even studied or went down the path of studying journalism in your career. But what makes a great journalist and a great reporter is really understanding how to ask the right questions and where to look and know where to look and know what to ask. How did you develop those skill sets over time? Because that certainly sets apart some of the greatest investigative journalists out there from the rest of the world.
Well, I'm very curious. I guess that's the major underlying theme, is being curious about how things are made and how people are treated who are making them. And I'm interested in safety, and I'm interested in good health and well-being and justice. So I've always been intrigued. I guess if something is unjust, I want to know more about it, and I want other people to know about it. I think there is definitely an insecurity streak in me also about working harder, just because I was, really insecure about not having gone to college and not having gone to journalism school. And so I'm sure that played into it. And, my story is, you began with, how depressing the news is. Well, I certainly contributed to that in a big way. The crews actually called me Bad News Baskin. Bad news for short.
That's so funny. As a compliment, I'm sure.
I'm not sure it was. I think sometimes, and sometimes not, because the stories that I was doing, you didn't always have an interview set up. I actually did an interview. I remember in Pakistan, walking past Uzis at the gate of a factory where they're saying, telling me to turn around and keep going, and just saying, oh, it's okay. I just want to talk to the factory manager, and waiting 5 hours to talk to the factory manager, and my crew and the interpreter, being really like, oh my God, is this really okay to be sitting here? But it was about child labor, making soccer balls for the whole industry. These soccer balls were being made in Pakistan in a little town called Sialkot, and the whole industry was making them there, and they were using child labor. So children weren't going to school. They were working. And it created a cycle of poverty. And exposing that story, changed, the soccer industry really stepped up afterwards in terms of making sure that soccer balls were child labor free.
Wonderful. Great stories all around. And I want to circle back to this notion of what you mentioned before, that a little bit of your naivety going into the space. And I think that might somehow play into what's made you such a great journalist, because, with my brand Unusual, we like to think of there's really two types of people in this world. Either you're average or you're not. And you clearly fall into the not average camp, or what we like to call unusual. And I feel like some of those qualities of that naivety going into the space almost allowed you or gave you permission to not do what the traditionally trained or conventional expert in the space would typically do. And I think you may have taken perhaps different angles or asked different questions in ways that others weren't asking about these big corporations. And I'd like for you to sort of maybe elaborate on that and, tell me if that really is, sort of resonating in terms of how you sort of carved your way through.
It does resonate. I think as the theme that I had in my head always that is that I don't ever want to cover a press conference or a fire or a shooting, that I wanted to do my own unique stories. I wanted to tell stories that weren't being told. And so the only kind of press conference I wanted to cover was one that was about a story that I had done, where there was a reaction to it. And I felt like when others are zigging, I want to zag. I want to point my camera in a different direction.
Was there ever a time along your journey? Because I'd imagine along this process, you probably upset many leaders at these different organizations. Was there any backlash or any consequences as a result of some of the reporting that you did?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was consequences for me in terms of what happened with me with Nike. When I did the story in Vietnam, one of the people I interviewed said that the word Nike had become a verb in Vietnam to mean abuse for employees. And of course, this was back in the 90s, in the mid 90s. So I ended up kind of being Nike'd in my journey at CBS. And definitely you could fill up a filing cabinet with companies complaining about me. But back in the day, there was a real appreciation of investigative reporting in terms of resources by both local news and the networks. And that has, very much dried up. We're in a time where the first people to go in a newsroom are the investigative reporters, because it takes more time. You're not doing the daily news. You're not running out covering fires and police press conferences. You're digging up stories that can also be litigious, can lead to lawsuits. And so actually one of the very last stories that I did was about a company, a pediatric dentistry company called Small Smiles. And this was a company headquartered in Colorado that was doing unnecessary baby root canals on children for the Medicaid money.
Oh, horrible.
It was horrible.
I remember that story, yes.
Yeah, it was kind of inconceivable. They had contests among the clinics for who could do the most baby root canals. And they gave the dentists big bonuses of, up to $10,000 a month if they exceeded the daily production goals for how many baby root canals each dentist was supposed to do. So, it was actually very hard.
Well, now you're making me depressed again. So let's, I love all of the work that you've done in the past in terms of uncovering corporate corruption and misconduct. But what's even more fascinating to me is if we could sort of turn the page a little bit and talk about some of the work that you're doing now, because you flipped the coin and I want you to talk about, rather than looking at, corporate misconduct, you're now looking at those organizations that are socially responsible, and almost the flip side. So tell us about that.
Yes. Well, I have to say that the company that was doing the unnecessary baby root canals did end up paying a $24 million settlement to the federal government.
Oh, so glad that was the outcome. Yeah. I hope they're still not in practice, though.
Well, they were thrown out of Medicaid. Some good came out of it, maybe not enough. But on the day that I was getting a DuPont Columbia Award for the story, the news director called me and said, we can no longer afford the luxury of investigative reporting. So that was another, kind of like big pivot in my career, thinking about, what's next. That investigative reporting is really not in its way out. I kind of think it's a renaissance time that we're in journalism, where there's a lot of experimentation and a lot of hope. But what really changed me, and it took a long time because sometimes I'm a slow learner, is a class that I took on something called appreciative inquiry that David Cooperrider is the father of that. And I took this class many years ago, actually, and it taught me to ask questions in a different way, that if you think about the questions you ask, frame the story that you tell, obviously. Well, maybe there's another way to ask questions that can, instead of looking for what's wrong, look at where are the opportunities, where's the resilience, where are the possibilities within an organization. And I did a mini design summit with David Cooperrider on this idea of having a Nobel Prize for business, because there is no Nobel Prize for business, and business gets as bad a rap as journalism does, really. And out of that summit, the people in the room wanted to celebrate the many, not just one business, but many. And it led to creating something called Aim to Flourish. And Aim to Flourish is now a website. We are working also with the UN Global Compact, and we're celebrating the Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 goals that I think of as the world's to-do list in the next, it's the next 14 years now. By 2030, this is what needs to happen in the world in order for there to be peace and prosperity and no hunger and no poverty, affordable energy, life, just everything that needs to happen, reduced inequalities. And so what we're doing is we're teaching the global goals to business school students, because these are the next leaders of businesses. And we're the only ones who are teaching the global goals, because you're not going to find it in any textbook. And so we're trying to create a shift in business schools and in the next leaders to think about what can they do to meet the biggest challenges on the planet, like climate change, like ending hunger, like good health and well-being and quality education for everybody. These are just amazing goals that, at first I thought these need to happen to save the planet, but obviously the planet will be here. Humanity won't be here if we don't get it right. And so these students, we now have 175 stories on our website that are about amazing innovations, inspiring innovations that these students have found around the planet in, 5 continents, in 46 countries, where these business school students go out and interview an innovator that they admire that's doing something that matches, that meets, that aligns with one of those sustainable goals, like ending poverty or gender equality. It's a beautiful framework for how to fix our world. And the students are having an experience when they interview an innovator using appreciative inquiry, where some of them are being offered jobs now.
Wow.
And it's changing how they think about what kind of company that they want to work in, or what kind of company they want to create in terms of tackling these big challenges. It's really exciting. And people aren't running away from me.
Yeah. That's always nice to have. I think that's fascinating. I love it. We need more of that type of thinking in this world. And I love how you flipped that whole, using investigative journalism rather than in the context of uncovering, bad things that are happening in the world, but utilizing some of the same techniques and tactics to uncover some of the good stuff that's happening in the world.
Well, it's like joining a movement. I don't think we're creating a movement. I think that the way you started out, Dr. G, with talking about, how depressing you find the news. Well, there's also a movement in media in terms of finding stories that, tell you about resilience and tell you about where the opportunities are. I think a steady diet of what's wrong makes people feel apathetic. They feel like there's nothing I can do about it. Whereas if you tell people who's doing it right, what's working, where the opportunities are, it's inspiring. And so I would love to invite everybody on your podcast, your whole audience, to join Aim to Flourish and read these stories that these business school students are writing about who is doing it right. Because I can give you some examples if you like. Just one.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Share one or two examples. That'd be
One
great.
that I love, it's an early one, came from Indonesia, from IPMI Business School, where the student found this company that was making plastic bags for the supermarkets. Well, you know what plastic bags are like. They're going to take 500 years in a landfill piling up. The company pivoted into making their plastic bags out of cassava, supporting the cassava farmers. They're making them out of tapioca now. They biodegrade in 2 weeks. And the students showed the process on video that you put these biodegradable bags in the earth and they disappear within 2 weeks. It's such a cool innovation.
Love it.
And why
Love
don't we
it.
have it, in other parts of the planet?
Absolutely. Yeah. That should be scaled across the world, including the United States. Absolutely. That's a great innovation.
And supporting the farmers too in these co-ops so that the farmers are getting a decent wage. And there's so many stories like this. More than 175 of them and growing. And at the end of the year, we're going to look at all the stories that are published for 2016. And in June 2017, we're going to give out Flourish prizes, 17 Flourish prizes to the top innovations, one for each one of the global goals, and celebrate the business, celebrate the global goals, celebrate the student detective that found it, and celebrate the school that brought it to our attention.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. Well, sign me up. And everyone on the podcast, you've heard it from Roberta herself.
You're all invited.
Go to the website, Aim to Flourish, and get yourself signed up. I think she's doing some fascinating stuff that we need to hear more of versus this doom and gloom world that we see on television. Love the story. Love what you're working on, Roberta. I want to, in this last portion, it's very quick. It's more of a rapid fire, Mad Libs rapid fire type of section where I'm just going to say, start off a sentence and you finish by filling in the blank to that sentence. So let's just have fun with this, and we'll close out with a nice little Mad Libs.
A Rorschach test.
Okay, so ready for the first one?
Ready when you are.
All right, here we go. The best piece of advice I ever received was
to be yourself. Yeah, and to pursue your dreams.
Great, love it. The one unusual habit I do on a daily basis is...
Oh, I listen to TED Talks. It's like my nightcap before I go to bed. I just learned so much from TED Talks and TEDx Talks.
That's great. I love listening to those too. And I'm also a podcast obsession with on my runs. But I also see you love from the pictures I've seen, I love that you like to spend time on the lake as well, behind your home.
Oh, I love the water. It is in my DNA. And my father had a company called Baskin in the Sun.
How appropriate. Love it.
Yeah. And
that's better. That might be better than the Bad News Baskin.
Definitely. And I was out on the lake for the first time yesterday on a sup. A friend brought over one of those stand-up paddle boards, and I just loved it. And I go kayaking, and I love to be swimming. I love even taking baths. Anything involving water is good for me.
Love it. Love it. Me too. Okay. If I had to write a book about myself, the title of the book would be...
I've been thinking about writing a book around my father's 10 commandments. So my father's first commandment was, so what? And I had a really hard time with that one, but I've come to embrace it. And maybe there's like a so what kind of story there. Or maybe it should be around his 10th commandment, which was be like a kid in a candy store. How he approached his day.
Well, I like the first one and the 10th one. I'd be fascinated to read everything in between. That sounds really interesting. So 2 more questions. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite and what would you talk about?
Wow. Dead or alive. I would love to invite Eleanor Roosevelt. I think that she was just amazing. And Esther Peterson, who was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Esther Peterson was like the founder of the consumer movement and of the labor movement and the women's rights movement. And nobody knows about her, but I got to know her in her 80s and into her 90s. And I miss her and would love to have her back. And I would love to know my grandmother. My maternal grandmother died 10 days before I was born. And She was an amazing woman, also ahead of her time. really smart and gifted in many ways. And I would have loved to have met her. So, and of course, I'd like to invite you, Dr. G.
Well, I'd love to be the fly on the wall listening in on that conversation.
Great question.
That sounds okay. The last one is, and you can have fun with this. I'm unusual because.
I'm unusual because even though I was, really passionate about bad news for most of my life, I am definitely an optimist, and I look at the world through a lens of optimism. And one of my favorite words is hope, and my very favorite word is synchronicity. I look for those moments in life on a daily basis where just the magic of the universe takes place. So although a lot of people, and I think a lot of people who knew me in my world of investigative reporting thought I must be like really mean-spirited or whatever, but I'm not. I'm hopeful. I think we're living in a Renaissance time with all sorts of complications, but things are getting better.
Well, I can personally talk from experience and having to know you. You're the exact opposite of any kind of mean-spirited individual. You're the most friendly, kind individual that I know. And it was such an honor to have you on the show. And I love where you're going with your new initiatives. And I love the stories that you've shared with us and our listeners. And hopefully I'll see you soon. But thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. And let's have dinner soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hi again. It's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting one new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.